On a warm afternoon in August 2012, a stack of papers landed on the desk of a Los Angeles courthouse clerk, and inside those papers was a name that stopped everyone who read it. Stevland Hardaway Morris. The world knew him as Stevie Wonder, was asking a judge to end his marriage. The man who had given the world "Isn't She Lovely?", who had turned devotion into a sound you could hum in the dark, was now fighting his wife over money, over their children, over the very life they had built together for 9 years. Fans who had watched Stevie and Kai Millard Morris walk red carpets hand in hand, who had heard him thank her from concert stages around the world, could not reconcile the image with the headline. How does the man who wrote the soundtrack to 1,000 weddings end up in a courtroom battle this bitter? To understand how it happened, you have to go back nearly 2 decades, to a rehearsal hall long before the Vows, the Twins, or the Fallout. Back to the moment a costume designer walked into Stevie Wonder's world and changed the shape of it forever. Kai Millard was not a singer or an actress chasing fame near a star. She was a costume designer, a woman with an eye for fabric and color, who had built her name dressing performers for the stage. In the early 1990s, she came into Stevie's orbit through his touring operation, hired to design pieces for his shows, to make sure the man audiences couldn't take their eyes off looked exactly the way the music sounded. Warm, rich, alive. Stevie, blind since infancy, experienced the world through texture and sound rather than sight. And something about Kai's presence, her voice, the careful way she described the cut of a jacket or the weight of a fabric in her hands, drew him in. They spent hours together backstage, in fittings that ran long past the point where fittings needed to run long. She learned to read his moods through the rhythm of his speech. He learned to trust the details she chose for him, the way a man learns to trust someone who dresses him for the world. Colleagues on the road noticed it before anyone said it aloud. The way Stevie lit up when Kai's name was mentioned. The way she stayed close during sound checks that had nothing to do with wardrobe. It was the kind of quiet, working intimacy that outlasts a single tour. And by the mid-1990s, it had become something neither of them tried very hard to hide. In 1997, their son Kylan was born. Years before either of them stood in front of an officiant, proof to anyone watching closely that whatever this was, it was already deeper than a professional arrangement. For years, Stevie and Kai lived as partners without a ceremony, raising their young son between tour stops and studio sessions, letting the tabloids speculate while they built a private life largely on their own terms.
Then, in the quiet of Hawaii, away from the cameras that trailed him at every award show, Stevie Wonder married Kai Millard Morris in an intimate ceremony by the ocean. Friends who were there later described a service filled with the kind of unguarded joy that comes only when two people have already weathered years together before making it official. Stevie, ever the romantic who had turned falling in love into a career, reportedly wrote new music for the occasion, a private gift meant for an audience of one. For a man whose most beloved songs, "You Are the Sunshine of My Life," "Isn't She Lovely?", had already given millions of strangers a language for their own devotion, marrying Kai felt like closing a circle. Reporters who had once questioned whether Stevie Wonder would ever settle down now had their answer. and the coverage that followed painted the picture the public wanted to believe. The legend of soul music, finally, truly at peace. Kai took on a new role as well, not just as his wife, but increasingly as a partner in his business affairs, someone trusted with decisions that reached far beyond wardrobe and stagecraft. Neither of them could have known, standing on that beach, how heavy that trust would eventually become, or how the very intimacy that made their bond so strong would one day be the thing that made its unraveling so painful. The years that followed looked, from the outside, like everything a fan of Stevie Wonder's music could hope for. In the mid-2000s, Kai gave birth to twins, expanding a family that already included Kailand and several of Stevie's older children from earlier relationships. Stevie, now a father many times over, talked openly in interviews about wanting to be present in a way his own touring schedule had sometimes made difficult in the past. He brought his children to sound checks, let them wander backstage during rehearsals, and spoke about Kai as the steady center that let him keep making music without losing his family in the process. At tribute shows and award ceremonies, he thanked her by name from the stage, his voice thick with the same emotion that colored his ballads. To longtime fans, it felt like watching the man behind Signed, Sealed, Delivered finally deliver something real for himself. Behind the scenes, Kai's role kept expanding. She moved from designing his wardrobe to managing pieces of his business ventures, weighing in on decisions about his companies, his properties, and the machinery that kept an empire built on decades of music running smoothly. It was, by most accounts, a genuine partnership, two people who trusted each other with both a family and a fortune. But a marriage where one partner holds that much responsibility carries its own quiet risk. Every joint decision, every dollar spent or withheld, every disagreement about a business deal was no longer just a marital spat. It was a fault line running straight through the finances of one of the most successful recording artists alive, waiting for the right pressure to make it crack. By the early 2000s, people close to the couple began noticing the strain. Stevie's business interests had grown sprawling and complicated. Record royalties, publishing rights, technology ventures, real estate, and managing all of it required constant, high-stakes decision-making that left little room for error. Friends later described growing disagreements over spending, over who controlled which accounts, over decisions Kai had made in her expanded role that Stevie came to view differently once the dust settled. There were reports of tension over a post-nuptial agreement the two had signed years into the marriage, a document meant to protect both of their interests that instead became a source of resentment once trust started to erode. Stevie, a man who had spent his whole life navigating a world he couldn't see, relied enormously on the people closest to him to describe reality accurately. And when that reliance felt betrayed, even in small ways, the wound cut deeper than it might have for someone else. Kai, for her part, felt she had given the marriage everything, her career, her independence, years of raising his children and managing his affairs, often without the public credit a wife in her position might have expected. By the summer of 2012, the two were reportedly living increasingly separate lives, even while maintaining appearances for the sake of their children and Stevie's public image. Insiders who worked with the couple say the final months were marked by long silences punctuated by sharp arguments about money. Arguments that had less to do with any single dollar amount and more to do with a deeper question neither of them wanted to say out loud: whether the partnership that had once felt unbreakable could survive being tested this hard. Then, on a summer day in August 2012,
it became official. Stevie Wonder filed for divorce from Kai Millard Morris in Los Angeles County's Superior Court, citing irreconcilable differences after 9 years of marriage. The filing listed a date of separation, formalizing on paper what had already been quietly true at home for months. Within hours, entertainment outlets picked up the story, and by nightfall it was everywhere. A headline that felt almost impossible to reconcile with the man's public image. This was Stevie Wonder, a multiple Grammy winner, the man who had sung about love as a kind of salvation for 50 years, now listed as a petitioner in a divorce filing like anyone else. Fans flooded message boards and radio call-in shows with disbelief. Some refused to believe it was real. Others wondered aloud whether any marriage, no matter how devoted it looked from a concert stage, could survive the pressures of fame, money, and a blended family this large.
For Kai, the filing arrived as both an ending and a beginning of something far more difficult. A legal fight that would force private disagreements about money and parenting into public court documents for the world to read. She retained her own legal counsel almost immediately, and within weeks, what had been a quiet, painful unraveling behind closed doors became a formal, documented battle, playing out not in the tabloid's imagination, but in sworn filings that laid bare exactly what 9 years of marriage, business partnership, and shared parenthood had built, and exactly what was now at stake in tearing it apart. What followed was months of contentious legal maneuvering that tested even Stevie's famously private nature. At the center of the fight sat the post-nuptial agreement the couple had signed years earlier. Kai's attorneys reportedly moved to challenge its terms, arguing she deserved a more equitable share of the wealth she had helped protect and grow during the marriage, while Stevie's side maintained the agreement should stand as written. Spousal support became a flashpoint, with each side presenting a different picture of what fairness looked like after nearly a decade of shared life. But the most painful battleground was custody of their 2 youngest children, the twins who were still young enough to need consistency neither parent wanted to compromise on. Court filings addressed school schedules, holiday time, and how the children would move between 2 households while their father continued a demanding international touring and recording career. Neither Stevie nor Kai spoke extensively to the press during this period, a rare show of restraint from 2 people whose lives had always played out partly in public. But leaked details from filings painted a portrait of 2 people who had once finished each other's sentences, now arguing, through lawyers, over the smallest logistics of a life they used to share without a second thought. For a man whose entire artistic identity rested on the belief that love could triumph over darkness, the process of dismantling his own marriage in a courtroom was, by every account from people close to him, one of the most painful chapters of his life, not because the love had entirely disappeared, but because so much of it had curdled into distrust before either of them fully understood how it had happened. The tabloids, predictably, could not resist the irony. Headlines juxtaposed lyrics from "Isn't She Lovely" against reports of dueling financial disclosures. Radio hosts who had played "Signed, Sealed, Delivered" at 1,000 weddings now discussed spousal support figures between songs. For older fans especially, listeners who had grown up on Stevie's music and measured their own marriages, anniversaries, and heartbreaks against his catalog, the divorce felt personal in a way most celebrity splits never do. This wasn't just a famous couple separating. This was the soundtrack of devotion itself being tested in open court. Some fans wrote to magazines defending Kai, pointing to years she had spent out of the spotlight supporting his career and raising his children. Others rallied around Stevie, noting the extraordinary trust a blind man places in the people who manage details he cannot verify with his own eyes, and how painful a breach of that trust could be. Industry insiders, meanwhile, worried less about the emotion and more about the empire, what a prolonged legal battle might mean for Stevie's business ventures, his touring schedule, and the vast catalog of music that had made him one of the wealthiest and most respected artists of his generation. Through it all, Stevie kept working, kept performing, his sunglasses as constant a presence on stage as ever, giving audiences no outward sign of the storm playing out in filing after filing behind the scenes. The divorce did not resolve quickly. Like many high-asset, high-profile splits involving complicated business holdings and young children, it dragged on for years, moving through mediation, amended filings, and periods where both sides appeared to step back from the more combative posture of the early months. Slowly, according to people familiar with the process, the fight over money began to matter less to both of them than making sure their children were shielded from the worst of it. Stevie, who had built his entire career on turning pain into something audiences could hold on to, reportedly pushed hard behind the scenes for a resolution that let him remain a consistent, present father to the twins, whatever the cost on paper. Kai, for her part, eventually secured the settlement terms she had fought for, closing the financial questions that had defined the bitterest phase of the case.
When the divorce was finally finalized, years after that first filing in 2012, there was no press conference, no public statement dissecting what had gone wrong, just paperwork quietly completed, ending a marriage that had once been held up as one of the industry's most genuine love stories. Those close to the family say Stevie and Kai eventually settled into a workable, if distant, co-parenting relationship, prioritizing the twins' stability over whatever bitterness remained between the two adults who had once promised each other forever by the ocean in Hawaii. In the years that followed, Stevie Wonder did what he had always done after heartbreak. He turned back toward the music and toward his family. In 2017, on his 67th birthday, he married again, quietly, choosing once more to believe in the kind of devotion his songs had always promised strangers. Friends say the divorce from Kai never made him bitter about love itself, only more careful about who he let manage the parts of his life he could not see with his own eyes. Kyland, the son born before the marriage even began, grew into a young man who would later step into his father's world as a musician in his own right, carrying the family's legacy forward. And the twins, once the subject of custody filings and courtroom arguments, grew up largely out of the public eye, shielded by two parents who, whatever their differences, chose in the end not to let a legal battle define their children's childhoods. What remains, all these years later, is a more complicated portrait of the man behind Isn't She Lovely? Not a fairy tale of unbroken devotion, but the story of someone who loved fully, trusted deeply, got hurt badly, and kept singing anyway. Perhaps that, more than any melody, is the truest thing Stevie Wonder ever taught his audience about love.